How about that? My daughter introduced me, right? Before she went up, I asked her if she wanted the stool, forgetting the time had passed. She's almost my size. Actually, one of our sister churches invited me to speak at a Black History Month program. I was gonna say, I've written here a few years ago, but as it turns out, really, it's several years ago, because it was before Skylar was born and when she was just a toddler. And she was a toddler who, as she said, she wouldn't leave my side without protest. So I did the whole thing with her standing behind me in the pulpit, holding my pant leg. And she was just looking out at the congregation like, I shall not be moved. It feels good to be loved like that. I also want to say thanks to the young men, the two Tristans today. Tristan, thank you for the scripture reading. The other Tristan, I see you with the camera growing up to be another Gordon Parks. Remember, you got to come back to do the closing song. And I'm glad I didn't have them read the entire sermonic text today. It's a little bit long. And it's late, so I'm still not going to read it. It's the parable of the talents. I don't know if, wait a second, am I on? How do I do this? Well, we're familiar with the story, right? We know the parable of the talents. It's in Matthew 25, verse 14 to 30. There's a version in Luke as well. You can take it down. We're not going to read the whole thing. But basically what happens is a nobleman leaves. He gives 3 of his servants, some versions say slaves. He gives them some money, says, go invest this for me. He gives them varying amounts. And the servant who got the least amount of money, the least, in one place they say 1 talent, when he returns as a king, that servant, the one who got the least, gets the death penalty because he failed to invest wisely. Now, if you've ever been in a situation where the funds are low and the debts are high, that parable probably stings a little bit. You might even begin to emotionally identify with that third servant, the one who got 1 talent. Because where's the justice in that? If you get 5 talents, it's easy to go out and dib and dab a little bit. You might take one and put some in some Apple stock, put some in some Alphabet stock, and say to yourself, I still got a little more to invest. But if you just got that 1 talent, where's the justice in that? And that's especially true in Black History Month, where you're probably seeing a lot of content about people being oppressed and mistreated. So you're tempted to say to yourself, a lot in this month, where is the justice? So like I said, there's a temptation to look at that third servant in the parable and maybe identify his experience with the struggles of Black people in this country. But that would be a mistake, and it would be a big one. Yes, there is something to be learned from that third servant's experience, but his is a cautionary tale. The things that he does are things that we have to avoid. The parable of the talents, it's not an instruction manual for progressives, because that third servant, he's nobody's hero and he's nobody's victim. Now, if you bear with me for a bit, I'm going to suggest another use for these February Black History Month stories, because I think the Black History Month and all those little narratives we've been learning ever since it started, there's a way that they're valuable, not just for all Americans, but for all Christians everywhere, no matter what you look like or where you're from. I think Black history stories are a new kind of parable. It's a new path forward for that fourth servant. Now, I know that doesn't make any sense right now, but if you'll stick with me this afternoon for a little bit, I'm going to talk about it. But first, I want to pray. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for another year. We thank you for another week. We thank you that you decided to dwell with us today. The people today have come for a blessing. I ask you, Lord, that you don't let anything that I've done anything that I do, prevent them from getting it. Amen. So like I said, Black History Month provides you with a whole set of new parables, new stories, new ways to learn. I'm going to give you an example of one. Now, back when I was in high school a few years ago, I did genetics research at Cornell Medical College. I was on a team that worked to isolate and sequence a section of chromosome 21. True story. The objective of our research was to develop therapies, I should say, for Alzheimer's disease and trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome. Now, I just said that here. Now, imagine me saying that sentence in high school. And you might not be surprised to learn that isolating a portion of chromosome 21 was not a sentence that impressed the girls. True story. But at the time, you couldn't tell me nothing. I felt like I was George Washington Carver and Garrett Morgan and Vivian Thomas and Charles Drew all wrapped up in one. Now, my job in the lab was growing volumes of cells from which we could extract genetic data. And in that job, in that role, I was introduced to a little Black history, but I didn't know it at the time. HeLa cells, or I call them HeLa cells because I don't know if I want to say HeLa too many times from this pulpit. Now, HeLa cells are special. HeLa cells are magical. See, before we had HeLa cells, scientists faced this great challenge. When you extract cells from the human body, they only live for a certain amount of time. No matter how much blood, how many nutrients you give them, they copy themselves, they duplicate a certain number of times, and then they die. HeLa cells do not. HeLa cells are immortal. Now, I said that when I did this project, I was standing on the shoulders of great Black men of science, like Carver and Drew and Morgan. But the truth is, the work in our lab and in labs all across the country, we actually depended on a contribution from a poor Black woman named Henrietta Lacks. Now, you may have heard of her recently because Oprah did a movie about her a couple years ago. But back in 1987, when I was working in the lab, she was still basically unknown. We knew who she was, but we didn't know who she was. So can I give you a quick biography? Henrietta Lacks was born the 9th of 10 children in 1921. So just a few months after our dear Sister Henry, actually, here comes Sister Henrietta Lacks. Now, her mother died giving birth to the 10th child. And back then, men were not likely to raise children all by themselves. They didn't have the strength that women do. So her father took her back to his family in rural Roanoke, Virginia. And the children got parted out to aunts and uncles and to her maternal grandfather. Now, she ended up living on a farm, a tobacco farm, and sharing sleeping quarters, beginning when she was about 4, sharing sleeping quarters with a couple of siblings and a couple of cousins, including one cousin named David Lacks. And yes, this is going where you think it's going. When she turned about 14, she and David Lacks had their first child. And they continued to live in that house, which had been the slave quarters on a tobacco plantation. Because slavery had ended, but its successor, sharecropping, had not. But they had a happy life together. They carved out a marriage for themselves. They got married when she turned 20, and they went on to have 4 more children, 5 children. But in 1951, right after she gave birth to her 5th child, she began to experience abdominal pain and bleeding. And I'm gonna spoil the end. She had cancer, and it was fatal. So she went back for her follow-up visit. Doctors didn't see anything. But in a little while, the pain became something she couldn't ignore. And the bleeding became something she couldn't ignore. So she had to find the only hospital that had a segregated colored section, Johns Hopkins, And that's a whole nother story, Johns Hopkins. That's a whole sermon itself on how it became what it is. But she went to Johns Hopkins the first time, and they tested her for syphilis. I want to pause here and talk about the insult that is. This is a married woman in her 30s who'd just given a baby, and she had symptoms of what was going to be the cancer that would kill her. And they tested her for a sexually transmitted disease and sent her home. When the pain became something she couldn't avoid, and she could actually physically feel with her fingers the tumor that was going to kill her, she went back to the hospital, and that's when they discovered that she had cancer. I want to pause again for the insult that is, because I'm not a personal injury lawyer. I'm not into malpractice. But she went in and said, this is the thing that I'm feeling, and that's when they found the tumor. She found it herself. Like I said, not a malpractice lawyer, but there's a part of me that knows that there are people I know, who, if they heard this story, would be out car shopping. And what's remarkable is, a few months later, she would die. But her story doesn't end here, because in addition to what was a really painful treatment, the doctors did something else that happens commonly to black people in those days if you went to a public hospital. The doctors removed a piece of her tissue, took a sample, because that was the way you would get it. You couldn't get it from people with money. You couldn't get it from anyone cared about. But if you were Henrietta Lacks or anyone like her, they might take your tissues and use them for scientific research, which I guess is legitimate, but that's what happened. But what they found out with Henrietta Lacks' cells was once you started feeding them nutrients and blood, they filled the receptacles. So they separated them out, put them in new receptacles, and they filled those up too. And they began to realize her cells, A, grew super rapidly, and B, didn't die. The doctor who took her tissues sent his assistant down to the morgue to get more. It's true. The woman who did it was interviewed later, and she said, Henrietta Lacks actually is a beautiful woman. And she actually recounted a tale of how it wasn't until she went to take that tissue from the body and saw her painted toenails that she realized this was a human being. Fast forward 70 years, and millions of those harvested cells, or miraculously their descendants, known as HeLa, are alive today. The cells from her tissue samples were mass-produced, and they've become priceless building blocks of medical research. HeLa cells are a cottage industry. Scientists have grown 50 million metric tons of HeLa cells. If you look on Amazon right now, you can buy HeLa S3 cell line slides for $199 plus $95 shipping and handling. Oh, thank you. And HeLa cells are literally shipped all around the planet and beyond. Both NASA and the Russian Space Agency sent HeLa cells to space to study the effect of zero gravity on human cells. So yes, if you're a student of black history, you've probably heard that Mae Jemison was the first black woman, African-American woman, to travel into space on the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 1992. And that is true. But Henrietta Lacks, that poor black woman from the South, her cells went to space in the 60s, twice. HeLa cells are what they used to test the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk used HeLa cells. You've heard of Jonas Salk, you probably have never heard of Henrietta Lacks. Because without HeLa cells, that testing would have been done on monkey cells. And monkey cells are expensive. Black woman tissue is not. HeLa cells led to breakthroughs in the study of herpes, leukemia, influenza, hemophilia, Parkinson's disease, certain types of genetic diseases, cancer, AIDS, cloning, the effects of radiation on toxic surfaces. It led to IVF, HeLa cells were the first ones that were used to even determine that we had 23 chromosomes. So if you went to school before Henrietta Lacks died, you did not know there were 23 chromosomes. I did because I went to school after Henrietta Lacks. Everyone benefited from her life, even me. Research on those cells helped get me into college. And while Henrietta Lacks was leaving this great posthumous legacy for the world, her family got no benefit and had no idea. Johns Hopkins kept going back to that family to see if they could find more about why her cells are immortal for 25 years. They kept going back and taking blood from her children and from her grandchildren. So while some people pass on a legacy of property and a legacy of money or a legacy of inheritance, because of that, I was going to say this one way, I'm going to say it a different way. Because of the nasty history of segregation, she ended up passing on a legacy of exploitation to her children and grandchildren. They kept coming back for them for more and more blood. And they didn't fully understand. These are just good, regular folks. And they didn't fully understand why these doctors kept coming to them. They thought they were getting medical treatment. They weren't. In fact, one of the stories that actually made me angry, and thankfully it wasn't in the movie, because I think no one would want that to be out, but it's the truth. This happened. There was a really important geneticist who they finally said, listen, I don't understand. Why are you still taking blood? Why is this, what's happening here? And he had written a textbook. And he was, I don't know if he meant to be evil, but he basically autographed the textbook that he'd written and gave it to them and said, it's all in here. And that bothered me. I took that one personally, just because that level of arrogance, it could be anyone. It could be my family. And when you are that arrogant that you can't even see these people as humans and take a couple of hours to explain who you are, what you're doing, and you're still taking their blood. So despite the fact that HeLa cells helped launch the multi-million-dollar biomedical industry, Henrietta Lacks died poor, and she didn't even get a headstone to mark her grave until 2010, after she'd been dead for 60 years. So Max, why did you tell us that awful story? I want to go back to the text, because it's going to explain why sometimes when I read things, what my background is, what I'm bringing to the table that makes me sometimes, and can make anyone misunderstand a text. In Matthew 25, I won't even say the verse. The servant who received 1 talent says words that resonate for someone like me. They pull at my heartstrings. The servant, the master, who's now a king, he's come back and he says, where's my money? I gave you money to invest. And this is what the servant says. Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, take what's yours. Now, stories like Henrietta Lacks's and all those anecdotes, all those bits of history that I've come up with and come to be fond of, the things that help make me who I am, make me want to go out and achieve sometimes, they make me sympathetic to that third servant. Because of my race and my class background, I'm tempted to hear in those words the sound of despair. I want to hear those words as someone speaking from a place of pain, anger, and righteous frustration. My inclination is to see those words as someone whose heart is on the edge of riot. Because I want to hear in that third servant's voice someone who's decided he's going to commit suicide by police. He's going to stand up to his master, who's now a king, and because of the shame and degradation he's experienced to that point, he's going to say something to him and take whatever comes. But if you read the text, that's not what's happening. We can be blinded by our background, blinded by the things that have happened to us, blinded by the fact that we work so hard to be proud, to be black, that we need to sometimes step back. So when you look close, you see four things. That third servant, he's not poor, he's jealous. When you look back at the text, you see that the third servant's choices are not born of fear or ignorance. His actions are meant to be insulting and insolent. That third servant who got one talent, he misrepresents his father's character just based on the facts that are in the story. He lies about his king. Finally, that third servant, there's something going on in the background. When you look at the text, you'll see it. If you read the whole thing, you can see what's happening. He doesn't want to be part of this king's kingdom. When he left, he was just a master. He returned a king, and that servant wanted no part of it. So let's start with the investment. That third slave, that third servant, he received a talent from the king. Now, in some translations, they call the talent a mina. In other translation, they call it a bag of gold. But what I did find was that amount he received was equal to, some places say 3 months' salary, some places say 6 months' salary. So when the king gave servant number 3 a talent, he gave him a lot of cash. It wasn't that he didn't have enough, because he had plenty. He was mad because he didn't have as much as everyone else. Servant 3 was upset and resentful because he got less. He wasn't abused or exploited, and he wasn't poor. He was jealous and resentful of what his fellow servants got. That's some old third servant behavior, and we can't have that. And let's look at the second thing, what he does with that knowledge. When he chooses to bury his master's investment, servant 3 pretended he had no alternative. Like I said, he says, look, I know you're a hard man, and I wanted to be sure y'all had your money when you came back, so I buried it. He's pretending he did what a prudent man does when your leader is a tyrant. He looked at his king like he was a madman. But that's not true, even though it's familiar. He had choices, because the king shows that the servant is a liar when he simply asks, why didn't you just put my money in the bank so I could get some interest? That's the least he could have done. He could have just taken his money and put it out to the moneylenders. It's in the text. Instead, what that servant does, because he wanted to be insulting and negligent, he actually bit off his nose to spite his face. He went out into the backyard, put in the extra effort to dig a hole, threw the dagger gold in it, and covered it up. It wasn't that he had no choice. He chose to take the low road on purpose. And again, that's some third servant behavior. We can't have that. Now listen to what he says about the king's character. He says, I knew you were a hard man. You reap where you don't sow. Now that servant was telling a king, his master, you ain't a king. You're a marauder and you're a thief. You take what doesn't belong to you. And what he's saying, he knows it's not true. It's in the facts of the story. He knows that the reverse is true. When the nobleman left, he gave money to all of his servants. He didn't take what didn't belong to him. He gave to his people. And then when he came back, he wasn't hard. He gave out massive rewards. He doubled the returns that everyone had. So that servant, he's lying. He was insulted by getting less, and he decided to clap back with an insult of his own. It was like he was doing mama jokes we used to do in 6th grade. We would say the worst things about people's mamas. We knew they weren't true, but the point was to insult the other guy. And that's what he's doing here. And that's some old third servant behavior, and we can't have that. Now finally, most people read this story in the Matthew version, but the Luke version has an interesting bit that's really helpful to understand what's happening in the story. Anyway, I'll just read it. It's Luke chapter 19, verses 12 to 15, if you have your Bibles. You can go to the start. It says, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas. Put this money to work, he said, until I come back. But his servants, his subjects, hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for his servants whom he'd given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. So now Luke's version of the story, it adds a little political intrigue to this. There's a controversy, a great controversy going on in the background. There's a political fight. Some people want this man to be king, and some people don't. The servant has chosen sides, and he chose the wrong one. That's what's going on here. There are a bunch of folk in verse 14 who said, we don't want this man to be our king. But the master he hated was coming back. And now all he could do is stand on the side and hate. Just be the hater that he wanted to be. So that servant, he wasn't reacting to oppose poverty, oppression, and exploitation. Not at all. He was reacting to regime change. It was about politics, not policy. And I saw a little bit of that this week. We're facing something like this in Virginia. As a matter of fact, all over the American South. Policy versus politics. There's a lot of attention being paid right now to 3 Democratic people in Virginia who made the unforgivable mistake. Well, 2 of them anyway. I'll leave one of them out. 2 of them, for some reason, decided it would be funny to go about in blackface at some point in their past. And the conservative side said, hey, they outed them. The Republicans said, look at these guys that you elected. They're in blackface. And I hate those symbols as a matter of politics. But those are the same folks. The folks who outed them have a law in North Carolina that passed that actually limits the federal government's, the federal judges said it. In any event, I have a friend who's a federal judge. He says this law in North Carolina limits black people from voting. It's a true policy. And people aren't talking about this law, but they're talking about these dummies in blackface. That's what we, as Christians, as thinking people, we have to begin to think and understand the difference between politics and policy, and not be blinded by people who would abuse us, deceive us by plugging into these pasts. Now, is blackface forgivable? Not really. Might we have to swallow it? Maybe. But that North Carolina law is hurting millions of people who are being eliminated from the voting rolls on purpose. A federal judge says that's what it is, and it has not gotten a drop of coverage. It's not sexy like the blackface. But let's go back. Because that's rebellion, that desire that the 3rd servant shows. He doesn't want the master to be the king. And that's ultimately a death sentence. And as Christians, Jesus spoke clearly. This is one of those parables that's easy. It's not mysteries. In the story, Jesus is the master. He's the one who's going to go away for a little while. He's the returning king. Right? That's an easy one. Are we on the same page? So we can't be that 3rd servant, even though sometimes we get less. And that's where Black history stories become important. And that's where they become a new kind of parable for us, because there's a 4th servant. You, me. And that 4th servant isn't just about being black. It's everyone who is down with us. It's everyone who wants our master to be a king. If you're a person of good faith and good conscience and you believe and you want my master, Jesus Christ, to be king, you're a 4th servant too. We take all comers. We've learned from the experience of segregation, don't do it. We learn from the experience of being oppressed, don't Do it. We take all comers. Because here's the heart of the matter. Because we live in a corrupt, sin-sick world, some people will possess more property, more resources, more things than other people. But when God breathed the breath of life into our nostrils, he gave each of us an intrinsic dignity, humanity. He gave us free will even to choose sin. That part of us is sacred, and it belongs to him who created us. It's what he meant when he said he created us in his image. It makes us special to him, regardless of what we own, who we are, or what we earn. Jesus made addressing poverty a key part of his ministry. In Luke 4, verse 18, when he said, "The Spirit of the Lord anointed me to bring good news to the poor." But here's what's important about Black history. Because I stole that. That's someone else's line. But Black history makes you add something. Because we live in a corrupt, sin-sick world, evil men kidnapped Africans who had been gifted by God with the same divinely sourced dignity, humanity, and free will, but their kidnappers treated them as property. They blinded themselves to their captives' humanity and convinced themselves that those Africans and their children and their children's children are beasts. But Jesus addressed that also in his ministry in Luke 4, verse 13, where he says, his gospel is to proclaim release to the captives and to let the oppressed go free. So when nations, states, communities, trade unions, politicians, and that chick in Burger King decides that we don't want Black people, when they reject the descendants of slaves, Jesus brought us into his orbit. When they sought to segregate us out, Jesus took us into kinship with him and called us his own. We're a new thing. We're the fourth servant in a new American parable. We owe no allegiance to evil men who would exploit us and our children's children the way they did to Henrietta Lacks, because he's chosen us along with the rest of humanity. And because of that, we have a right to belong to the King if we choose. Now, there are those who would convince us that we're less, but like the third servant, they are liars. They mischaracterize God and his will for us. We're the fourth servant community. If you seek justice and you're allied with our master and our King, you're welcome with us. Now, the third servant approach is the polar opposite of the American parables I grew up with. In these stories, people who themselves or whose ancestors were brought to this hemisphere as property were desperate to find ways to contribute, to make their communities better, to make their children's lives better. And whether they had been kidnapped from Africa and brought to South America, the Caribbean, Canada, or even these United States, the heroes and heroines of these tales did their best to prove themselves worthy, even when that dedication wasn't mutual. I briefly mentioned that Mae Jemison was the first Black woman to go into space, other than Henrietta Lacks' cells. Now, Mae Jemison, she was a doctor and a neuroscientist with degrees from Columbia University and Cornell Medical College. She somehow also found time to dance with Alvin Ailey and to be an astronaut. That's impressive, no matter who you are. But despite all of her degrees and her accomplishments, she was forced to file a lawsuit against the city of Nassau Beach, Texas, for police brutality because they threw her to the ground and roughed her up at a traffic stop. But despite the disrespect, she continues to speak out, still tries to get girls involved in silence because she exhibits fourth servant behavior. I mentioned I was inspired by Dr. Charles Drew. Charles Drew was an African-American physician who developed ways to store and process blood plasma in blood banks. Blood plasma is blood without the cells. And he directed American and British blood banks in World War II. He saved thousands of lives, not just in the war, but even after he came home, by blood banking. Blood that could not be stored before could be stored in refrigerated mobile units thanks to his genius. But he retired from the Red Cross because Americans pushed on the world a ruling that said black blood needed to be segregated from everyone else's blood. And in protest, he resigned. When I was a kid, there was a myth. It turns out it's not true. I did the homework. The myth was that, because he died in a car accident, he exsanguinated is the word they use, which means he bled out. And the myth when I grew up was that Dr. Drew died because he couldn't get to a segregated hospital in time and they couldn't bring the blood. And that's actually not true. But it's funny that even though he died so long ago, long before I was there, people's experience with segregation made that a believable lie. Because even though he got good care, most black people did not. Matter of fact, if you look on the internet now, you might still find that myth that Dr. Drew died because he couldn't get to a segregated hospital. But just as there are these great triumphs. Oh, I mentioned that I thought I was Vivian Thomas. I don't know if you saw the movie A Thing the Lord Made. Well, in any event, he's someone who, for a number of reasons, he could not go to med school. So he became a lab tech and a surgical technician. And he helped develop the blue baby operation. If you know what a blue babies are, that's where blood from the heart does not get properly to the child's lungs and the babies end up looking blue. So what he did, Vivian Thomas, figured out ways to do a surgery to move the blood vessels so that the blood could get properly to the children and save countless lives. But they wouldn't let him do the surgery. They got a box and stood behind a doctor of a different race. And poor Vivian had to stand on the box and look over the shoulder of the doctor and say, do this, no, do that, do this, do that. He helped develop the physical technique, and they wouldn't let him do it. As a matter of fact, he was paid so little as a surgical technician that the doctor who he was supervising in the surgery room would hire him to make extra money as a bartender for his parties. But these triumphs, these things we were able to achieve, we could go on like this for hours. But just as there are great triumphs, you don't have to look very far to see examples of where we've fallen for that temptation to give in to resentment, hopelessness, and despair. To find moments where our people responded to oppression in the same way that the third servant in the parable responded to a bag of gold, with resentment and bitterness. And the great challenge for the fourth servant, the one we can't achieve without divine help, is to resist the temptation to bury our talents and instead of burying hatred and resentment against those who sinned against us. I'm going to say that sentence again because I flubbed it horribly. Our great challenge, the one we cannot achieve without divine help, is to resist the temptation to bury our talents and to instead bury resentment and hatred against the people who have sinned against us. We are called to love them. Black history is full of those moments where we've fallen short. Well, Black history isn't full of those moments where we've fallen short. The evening news is full of those moments. Fox News and World Star Hip Hop. You can see us behave in ways that bring us shame. But our best stories, our greatest successes happen when we choose to go high when they go low, and to ally with people of good conscience to follow God's will for us. The fourth servant testifies to the world, look what evil men did to us and to our ancestors, and yet we trust. That's our contribution to the fabric of the nation. That's our contribution to the world. Despite the fact that we learned this gospel by the sword and in slave quarters, we still lift up this gospel. And it's not just us. Oppressions happen to everyone almost. Whether it's Japanese Americans who were detained during World War II, or families separated at the border, or people fleeing violence in their home countries, or people who are just trying to get away from plain old poverty. Oppression is everywhere. Oppression is oppression. Injustice is injustice. And it all has the same source: sin. Ever since the devil targeted Job, that's been his strategy to separate us from God. Our enemy wants to make us resent a God who loves us and would save us, and who sent his son to save us by his grace. He wants us to take Job's wife's advice and curse God and die. He wants us to do what the third servant did, to curse the master and die. And that's the value of February for our entire nation. Every day, our community is in the crucible. Every day, as individuals, we stand in the crucible, and we have a choice to make. Do we bury our talent, or do we invest? And every day, the wise among us choose to take our talent and invest it for our master. So we have to ask ourselves the question: are we living the fourth servant life? Are we? Greg, I saw your brother-in-law at the funeral last Sunday, and Pastor Wellington was grieving with us because he was friends with Sister Henry. Who wasn't? But he had to leave because he was heading to Brooklyn, to the Brooklyn lockup, the federal lockup, where prisoners had been without heat, electricity, hot water in the coldest days on record. And as a fourth servant, Pastor Wellington, my friend, pulled me aside. He said, listen, I need to go talk to them. He had legal questions about what rights they had. And I had to answer him because he was doing the fourth servant work. Jesus preached it in Matthew 25, verse 36 to 38. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And that's what he was doing. He was being the fourth servant. I have these maddening apps on my cell phone. One is called Ring, and the other is called Citizen. And I need to take them off because they sit at work and drive me crazy. But I got 2 hits this week. One for a police-involved shooting on 165th Street, I think it was. And I said, so I very quickly said, because I know, I did the pastor@grandconcourse.org. First elder@grandconcourse.org. Check this out. I don't know where they are, but I know they're doing the fourth servant work. And both of them came back, wow, we're already here. They're doing the fourth servant work. They're going out into dangerous places, not because it's sexy, not because the Bronx is getting gentrified and it's a good place to hang out. Pastor was already at church doing fourth servant work. He said, oh, I didn't even know. When I asked him about it today, he said, oh, I forgot all about it. And when I talked to my mom, and I said, you know what, there's a barricaded man. This is a separate one. I sent her a text. Someone has barricaded themselves in. There's a police operation. They might have to kill the guy. And she said, oh, I'm down visiting Brother Henry. I'm like, that's 165th Street. You're around the corner. But she was there because she's doing fourth servant work. I mentioned when I was in high school, I did this project. And it's a senior project. It was a senior project, which meant that when I was done working, I could just leave. It was amazing. So this one day I decided we set it up in advance, I decided I was going to go meet Steve. Now, when I was in high school, that was not Black History, but when Steve was in high school, that was Black History time. And his school at the time was known as Evander Childs. Now, about 10 years ago, in 2008, thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that school was broken up. It was labeled as an impact school, and it was split into 6 smaller specialized schools as part of the mayor's Small Schools Initiative. But in 1987, there was no Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Evander was rough. So I went out, met him out front. Well, I was waiting for him out front. He came out, I don't know if you've seen it. It's on Gun Hill Road. Has anybody seen Evander? Anyway, he comes out, he comes down the stairs, and no sooner we start walking, trying to figure out what we're going to do, I hear bap, bap, bap. Now, if you ever heard gunshots, it's not dramatic like in the movies. The sound of a gunshot, it doesn't immediately register as little bits of death hurtling towards you at the speed of sound. It's just pap, pap, pap. Now, Steve sprang into action, or ducked into action, whatever you want to call it. And he's like, now, I was smart enough to be sequencing DNA, but I was way too dumb for duck for bullets. Flash forward 30 years. I'm at the lunch bunch with Steve and Nigel and some people. They're talking about, the lunch bunch, if you're watching on television, we eat, if you're watching on the internet, we fellowship together as a family. Many of us live a little farther away. We're coming over bridges like Elder Malcolm or Elder Mitchell, and thus we go downstairs and eat together. And I don't know where the lunch bunch name came, but that's what it is. So we were downstairs talking, and Steve said, oh yeah, he was irritated about the fact that we didn't get this site. I was like, site? What do you mean you're buying a site? It's like, oh yeah, he's the president of the Homeschool Foundation, and they are looking to expand our constituent school, Oakview Prep, into a high school. Because he was dissatisfied with the options he had when he was in high school for himself. He and Christians like him are opening up a high school that is another option for their children. That's what the fourth servant does. That's what we do. We make it better. We go out and we partner with the Lord and we invest. That's a fourth servant thing. And that's what the Lord is going to call us to do. He's going to call us to task. He's going to ask us, what did we do with our time? What did we do with our talent? What did we do with our children? What did we do with what he gave us? That human dignity that he put in every one of us. He didn't give us all. We didn't all get money. Some of us were robbed. Some of us were mistreated by our families. Some of us don't have. But he's still going to call us for what we got. And we need to have a fourth servant answer. Now, there are times when as a community, and even as individuals, we've chosen to bury our talent. I know I have. It can be so tempting to waste your time, to waste your energy, and misuse your influence. Sometimes I wish I grew to be 6'6" with a wet jump shot. But that's not who I am. But he gave me enough. And there's still hope. That's the ultimate message of the 10 talents. There's still time. The master has left. Part 1 has happened. The master has given us gifts. Part 2 has happened. But he hasn't come back yet. So we can actually, if you buried a talent, like I'll admit I have sometimes, it's still time to go out into the backyard, dig up your talent, take it out, and invest it. To do what the Lord wants us to do. If you can hear my voice, whether in this room or if you're watching online, there's still time. He hasn't come back yet. We can still live our best lives until he returns and figure out what our answer is going to be. Now, the question is, how do we get there? What gives us the right to call ourselves the fourth servant? How do we become a hero or a heroine in this new parable? And I can give you some clues. When I worked at Cornell, I cultured HeLa cells in a serum that was designed to mimic blood. HeLa cells solve the problem of growing human cells outside the human body because they died because they needed blood. In your body, the nutrients and oxygen that cells need to stay alive get carried to each cell by blood. Henrietta Lacks's family found out her identity because Johns Hopkins continued to contact them for 25 years looking for their blood. Charles Drew innovated a way to process and store blood plasma in blood banks where he stored blood. Dr. Drew innovated ways, and he died in a car accident when his injuries caused him to bleed out. He ran out of blood. Vivian Thomas helped pioneer surgical procedure to help bring blood to babies' lungs, solving the blue babies because they needed blood. What protects the first elder and our pastor? When they're traveling through bullet-riddled areas, they're covered in the blood. Why am I alive today? I'm covered in the blood. Why did me and Steve walk away from gunshots in front of Evander? We were protected by the blood. What can wash away my sin? What can make me whole again? The blood, the blood, the blood. Jesus' blood allows us to be the fourth servant. We can just claim it. We get to walk in and say, I am yours because you paid the price with your blood. I have held immortal cells from a poor black woman who was raised on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. It's not a giant leap for me to believe that that blood can save, that blood can heal, that the body of Jesus Christ helps us form a new covenant that can save us all, that the blood can make us his servants. I believe the blood can never lose its power. And that's what takes us to Hebrews 9:14. Thank you, Tristan, where it says, if, I'm going to paraphrase the first half and say, if Henrietta Lacks's cells can be immortal, how much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? So let's go out and get a return for our master's investment while there's time. Happy Sabbath and enjoy Black History Month.